Sorrentino, and this is Jigging Doormat Fluke. So most of you guys probably don't know who I am. That's okay. I'm just a hardcore New Jersey angler. I am the president of the New Jersey Fishing Club, president and founder. For those of you guys who don't know, the New Jersey Fishing Club, we are a tournament-based organization. We run a lot of tournaments throughout the state, throughout the year. A lot of, try to fix that microphone. A lot of boat-based tournaments. We do some party boat events and just a bunch of events throughout the year. You can learn more about that. That's not why we're here tonight. But so we're going to talk about catching big fluke, big flounder throughout the season. We got a couple things to talk about. We're going to go all the way through the entire fluke season. We're going to talk about what the fluke season entails. Obviously, most of us should know those dates. And then we kind of split the season into different compartments. So we're going to early season, mid-season, late season, when to transition to the ocean from the bays. Talk a little bit about fishing from party boats for those of you guys that maybe don't have access to private boats or are just more comfortable on a larger vessel. So I got some tips for you guys on becoming successful in the party boats. I'll give you some tips for tournament fishing. I'm an avid tournament fisherman, and I'm pretty good at it. Not to be too cocky, but over the last 2 seasons or so, me and my crew have amassed over $50,000 in tournament winnings just catching fluke or summer flounder. So give you some of the tips that we've used to be successful in those tournaments and hopefully help you out. And then at the end, if you have any questions, save them for the end. I'll be happy to answer any questions you guys have. So we will start with the fluke season in New Jersey. Obviously the dates are May 22nd to September 19th. That is our legal time to catch and target summer flounder. And so I guess the most important thing to realize is where to look for those flounder and the fluke and what time of the year where you should be looking. And in order to understand that, there's 2 things that you have to understand about fluke. Number 1 is the migration patterns, where they are at each time of the year, where they're going, and where they're going to be. And so fluke, it's very simple. They migrate east to west. So in the wintertime, they move offshore very deep to the continental shelf, and then come the springtime, they move back into the shallow waters in the bays to spawn. And that's pretty much what they do every single year. They go out once the water gets cold, and when it starts getting warm in the spring, they come back in. Simple stuff. Fluke are ambush predators. No matter where you're catching fluke, whether it's in the bay, the rivers, the oceans, they hunt the same way. They're not out targeting fish. They're not like striped bass or bluefish where they're swimming around trying to find prey. They kind of find an area where they know the prey is going to be, and they'll just sit in that area. They'll wait. Obviously, they're bottom fish. They lay on the bottom. They camouflage, and they just wait for something to swim by where they can ambush their prey. So fluke are ambush predators, and that is obviously important to learn. So I'm not sure if you guys can hear me with this microphone, so just let me know in the back and I'll start yelling. Yeah, I think I might have broke it. Might have been broken when I got it. I don't know. So they're ambush predators. That's what we're saying. So early season. This is one of my favorite times to target fluke. Is the beginning of the season, the end of May, and I would go typically until the beginning of July. And this is when I target fluke in the back waterways of New Jersey. So my home waters are Barnegat Bay, but I fish throughout the whole state. So I'll go down to Absecon Inlet. I'll fish all the way up Raritan Bay. I like the Shrewsbury, the Navesink rivers. I'll go all over to find these fish. So early season, there's a couple things to key in on to be successful. So obviously, as I mentioned, the fish are migrating inshore this time of year. So they are coming into the shallow waters. The waters are still relatively cold for fluke in May. So what we're doing is we're trying to focus in on areas that have warmer water. We want to find the higher time or the higher temperatures during the tides, which early season tends to be the end of the outgoing. The closer you fish to inlets, the closer you want to be to the end of outgoing tide. So the water's moving into the bay, into the shallows, the mud flats, the sun's heating it up all day long, and then it's pushing out in the afternoon. And when you get a nice outgoing tide, mid to late afternoon after it's been beat on by the sun all day, that's a good time to fish. So one of the great things about fishing for fluke in May is you do not have to wake up super early. You want to be successful in August and September, you're waking up really early early in the morning. But in May, you can sleep in, you can get them in the afternoon, and you can focus more on the tides and the temperatures. And what I look for in the bay is kind of what I call ledges and edges. So we want to find areas where they can trap bait fish. So, or you know, shrimp, crabs, they're just eating anything that kind of passes by. So they'll sit in an area around a ledge or an edge where water from tide movement is getting pushed, and these smaller bait fish that don't have this strength to swim against the tide are kind of getting washed over. So that's the area. A lot of times it's just channels. So especially up north, if you fish in North Jersey at all, the rivers up there are very narrow. Manasquan River, they're very narrow. There's not a lot of channels, so there's not a lot of ledges and edges. So you can focus your efforts real simple. If you're ever out on a Saturday, you're just a boater, you're like, what are all these little boats doing in the channels? Well, that's where the fish are, and that's why they're there, and that's why navigating is sometimes difficult. So you want to focus kind of on ledges and edges. If it's a small river, the channel's going to do great. As you come down south and water expanses, gets bigger, you can look for sod banks, you can look for backwater eddies. Anywhere there's a drop off, if you have Navionics on your phone, one of the things you should be doing before you go out is kind of pulling that up and just looking at the depth charts, the depth changes, and looking for an area that has a good amount of water flow and a nice drop. So typically early in the morning, first thing in the beginning of the season, I'm looking really shallow. So the water, it's more about water temperature. They feed when the water's warmer. So oftentimes, the end of May, beginning of the season, I'm starting in like 3 to 4 feet of water. So very, very shallow. They're coming up off the ledges, and that's kind of where the bait's gonna be, because that's just where they're feeding that time of year. So start there, start shallow, and then you'll work your way into the channels. And then as the season goes on, into the weeks, we'll kind of work through those channels and get closer to the inlet, because those fish are going to start, and it happens in waves, but they're going to start staging up to go to the ocean, and that's kind of what we'll talk about next. So obviously we want to touch on the equipment and baits that I use in the bay. And I go incredibly shallow. Sorry about this mic, guys. I don't know why that's doing that. But I go incredibly light. So you want to fish as light as you are capable of fishing, and we want to stay vertical with our jig. So I am a 100%, I use Gulp all the time, and I am fishing very light jigs. So typically in the back bay, I am fishing a 1/4 ounce to a 1/2 ounce jig. And I get away with using very light tackle to do that. So this is a G Loomis E6X. It's rated to a 1/4 ounce to 5/8. I fish a Stratic 3000, or 2000 rather, sorry, 2500, and 10-pound braid. So a lot of guys, when they fish with me, they're like, this is too light. You can't hold bottom. And that's because you're not fishing the right way. So the most important thing is controlling your drift. So people ask me all the time, what's the proper drift speed? How fast should I be drifting? And there's not a correct answer to that. So if you watch John Skinner's videos and he tells you should be drifting at 1 knot, maybe in Long Island that works, or maybe at slack tide that's ideal. But during the tide movement, that is not the case. You want to be drifting at the same speed that the water is moving, and you want to be going in the same direction that the water is moving. So my 1/4 ounce jig, my goal is to be fishing vertically, straight up and down. So what I do is I control the drift. And you'll see, like in the bay, I'm fishing in these little tin boats. They're just piece of crap little boats. Get up in the shallow waters. I mean, this boat, this is my nephew, this boat is, I don't know, probably 60, 70 years old. I got a little 30 horsepower Honda tiller on there. I like the tiller because it's easy for me to control the boat, where it's going, and I can slow down my drift and I can control my drift. So if the water movement, so we'll say the water's moving from my left to my right? The fluke are sitting with their head into the current, just waiting for bait to be washed over them. And they're going to be lined up, if you're in the right spot, they're going to be lined up throughout this entire drift, or along this entire channel, or this ledge, or this edge. And you want to lengthen your time of presentation in front of those fish. So when you're drifting, if you're just going with the wind or the tide, 95% of the time, you're either not going in the right direction, you're not going at the right speed. You know, if the water's moving this way and the wind is coming across this way, my drift is coming on a diagonal and I'm gonna miss the fish in the zone where I need to be. So what I do and what we do with the tiller motor is we kind of put our stern into the wind and we can control, and you can do it with the center console also, you can control the wind. So I kind of put the boat in reverse to slow the jig down. So I have my jig straight down. As the current takes it, I take the boat out of gear so the boat catches up to my jig. And then when I start going back and the boat gets in front, then I take the boat out of reverse and we let the boat move. Or I put the boat in reverse and I slow the boat down. We want to keep the bait vertical. So it's very important, whoever is on the motor when you're drifting, your fluke fishing is very active in the back bay. You do not want to go out, park your boat in an area, turn the motor off, drop your baits down, and just sit there and wait. We call that drifting and dreaming, and you're gonna do a lot more dreaming than you are catching. So you wanna be very active. If you see this setup, this is a tournament day. There's 4 of us back here. The front 3, that's the most fun place to be because all I have to do is worry about catching fish. This guy in the back here, this is the most important place to be because that's the guy who's controlling the drift. That's the guy who's making sure we're in the right zone, we're going the right speed, and we're staying there. So we take turns on whose spot that is because it's a little bit difficult to have one hand on a motor and the other hand on the rod. But that's very important. We do it in the center console too. You just need 2 hands, so it's a little bit more difficult to fish. That's why we like the tillers in the bay, because I can have one hand on the motor and I can have one hand on my rod. Also, if you have a trolling motor, very advantageous to the bay, especially with like a spot lock, where you can just have a remote on your neck and you can hit a button to slow yourself down. But that's basically what we're doing. We're controlling that drift. And if you guys have questions on that more, we'll talk about it later. Jigging techniques are very simple. Like I said, I just use a single jig. So I lost the teaser a few years ago. I know a lot of guys fish teasers in the bay and the ocean for fluke. I just fish a single jig, round head jig. I put a gulp on there. In the bay, we want to match our baits to what's in there. So usually early season, the fluke are feeding on shrimp. They're feeding on small crustaceans, crabs, and small bait fish that are in the bay. So we want to use a 4-inch gulp bait is typically what I'm rigging up, or not typically, always. So it's either a 4-inch Gulp Grub or it's a 4-inch swimming mullet, and 99% of the time it's just a white one. There's a million colors. White's the only color you need. Jigging, very simple. The most important thing, like we talked about, is that the jig is straight up and down. The presentation is vertical. And all I'm doing, you can see it's got a nice flex in my rod tip here. Right? The rod's designed for light jigs, so I'm just lightly moving my wrist. It's a light rod, it's a light reel. I'm fishing a light jig, I can do this for hours. And that's it. That's the only technique I'm using. My drag set's super loose because there's not a lot of snags in the bay. I'm not worried about losing a fish. There's plenty of room for it to run. Loose drag, light jigging, just keep it moving, keep some action on there. You can go slow, you can pop it. There's not like a right way or a wrong way. As long as it's moving, you don't want to just sit there, stick the rod in the holder, and then, you know, if that's your thing, you want to sit there, put the rod in the holder, drink a beer, that's cool too. You're just not going to catch as many fish. So keep it moving, keep it bouncing, very simple. If you're in the strike zone and the fish are there, they're going to eat it. So this is my go-to back bay rod. I typically just bring the one. I don't go crazy with rods in the spring. So next thing, we're moving to early July, mid-July, depending on the temperatures, and we're moving to the ocean. So this is when the fish begin to kind of stage out of the bay. They've spawned, the waters are getting warmer, and they're beginning to move out of the bay. And this happens at different paces throughout our state. So in the north, in like the Navesink and the Shrewsbury rivers and the Manasquan River, where the rivers are small, it's mostly shallow water, they're going to move out early. So that bay bite might end in June up there, depending on the weather. So you just have to kind of key into when this happens. In Barnegat Bay, in AC area where there's pockets of super deep water, fish will stay in our bays the whole season. They'll stage out later. So it happens kind of in runs. But in July is typically when that starts happening. So I usually won't even venture into the ocean for fluke until the first week of July. July 4th weekend and onward is typically when I'll start moving out in the ocean. And the fish kind of are doing the same thing in the ocean. Like I said, they're not hunting. They're finding an area that's going to hold bait, and they're sitting and waiting. And so for us in Jersey with our sandy coastline, that's artificial wrecks, reefs, coral bottoms. If you're lucky enough to fish out of Belmar and North, they have a rockier bottom. It's kind of easier to find some fish there, and you can take longer drifts. In the south, we want to focus on our reef sites. So I'm out of Barnegat Inlet. That means Garden State North. That means Barnegat Light Reef. We fish all the way down to Little Egg Reef, Garden State South. There's plenty of artificial reef sites, and you're looking for the structure. These fish will hug up against the structure because that's going to have a nice water break. So when you're in the ocean, the direction of the drift is not as important as being on the structure. So there's structure. I mean, this stage is a good example of what kind of the structure can look like if you're on a wreck. If this is an old boat, it's broken down. There's drops in between. There's rocks. There's ledges. And this is kind of where the fish are going to hide. If you look at any underwater video from scuba divers or just somebody who has an underwater camera, the fish hug the structure. So they're going to be posted up against this stage. If this stage is a piece of structure, they're on the ground here, right on the ledge. They're tucked in against it, and they're waiting for a crab to swim by or a small porgy to come by, and then they're going to jump out. So you want to be, in order to be successful, you have to stay on the structure. And this is where fluke fishing can get a little bit expensive because there's rocks down here and we have sharp hooks. So you're gonna snag up, you're gonna lose gear if you're fishing aggressively on the structure, which you should be, because that's where you're gonna find the majority of the fish. And what we do is we do what we call micro drifts. So if we have a piece of structure that's, say 25 to 45 feet long, we're gonna do the same thing with the motor, we're just gonna do it in a different fashion. So we're gonna get on that structure and we're gonna use the motor to the stern in the wind, and we're gonna slow down our drift to maximize our time above that structure. So we wanna keep our jigs in that structure before we get blown off of it. And this is a great time for like a trolling motor. We don't typically use a trolling motor, but if I'm on a boat with a trolling motor, you can spot lock right on top of the wreck and you can cast around and it has the same effect. And then you can kind of wreck hop. But that's where the fish are. They're tight to the wreck and you need to really focus there. I always use a 4-ounce round ball jig head. It's always heavy enough, and if it's not heavy enough, you're not on the motor properly. So if you find yourself scoping out, I mean, honestly, 6-ounce, 8-ounce jig heads, if you're buying those, just stop doing it because you're fishing the wrong way and you're not going to be successful. So you want to use the 4-ounce, and you can go lighter. I have 2 ounces, I have 1 ounces in my bag, but the 4-ounce is always enough to get to the bottom and stay vertical. And so it's just easy to tie those on quickly or have a bunch of them ready to go. And I always use a 6-inch Gulp Grub in the ocean. And now we have the 8 inches, which is even better. I want a big bait because big fish eat big food. That's just the plain and simple of it, And we're just doing kind of the same jigging technique. In the ocean, it's a little different for me. So in the ocean, I go with a conventional rod. This is the Jigging World Shogun. It's 7.6, and I use a 200 size spinning reel. And my power handle fell off somewhere. So if you find a blue power handle, just let me know. It's about 50 bucks, so I'd love that back. But I basically fish the same way. I'm just doing a night. You can see the tip is sturdier because we're fishing a much heavier jig, and I'm doing the same thing, just kind of a constant wiggle, if you will. It's not a big jerk. If this gets tiring, I'll slow down and just do a nice pop. I just want to, same thing, I just want to keep the bait moving, and that's it. I mean, I fish gulp 95% of the time. The next slide I'll tell you when I don't, but I'm fishing gulp almost always, and I'm just keeping the bait moving. Very simple stuff. Just keep the bait moving, make sure you're in the zone, you'll catch the fish. I also bring a spinning rod when I fish the ocean. This is a Daiwa back bay rod, Daiwa back bay Saltus reel, 3,000 size spinning reel. You can go 3,000, 4,000 size. Typically spool everything in the ocean with 20-pound test. I'm using oftentimes a 30-pound leader. I didn't touch on that. Also in the back bay, I'm using a very light leader, 10 to 15 pounds of fluoro. I'm tying directly with an FG knot. I never use terminal tackle when I can get away with it. Just want to stay away from terminal tackle. Very confident my knots are good. So this I use for a different purpose. This is my casting around rod. Like I said, if I am spot locking, I'm taking this rod, I'm whipping away from the boat, and I'm jigging back. Just kind of, the same jigging motion, but obviously I'm coming back to a stationary boat, so I'm reeling as I go. And like I said, as long as the bait's moving and you're in the right spot, you're gonna catch the fish. So kind of could talk about when to set the hook. A lot of people struggle with that, especially in the ocean when you have a lot of interference fish, we'll say. Sea robins, sea bass can be gnarly at stealing your gulp tails. We're trying to keep our costs down when we're fishing because we're already losing enough jigs in the wreck. We don't need to lose $1.25 gulp tail every 2 minutes to a sea bass. So I want to be very aware of when I need to set my hook. So make sure you have a rod that is sensitive. Like I said, this Jigging World Shogun works for me. 4 ounce, I can kind of feel everything I'm doing here. And what I want to feel when I'm jigging, I'm not really feeling a strike. A lot of that strike, when you feel that nice pull, that's going to be your sea bass. That's going to be a small sea rabbin that grabbed your bait and tried to swim away with it. The right fluke is just going to swallow the entire jig whole. You're not going to feel a strike. You're just going to feel like weight. You're going to feel something heavy. And that's when you want to set the hook. Sometimes that's going to be the wreck. That's okay. Set on the wreck. You'll kind of like figure that out. You'll lose a couple jigs. But I tell you to set on the wreck because one time I didn't, and I lost probably one of the biggest fish of my life. So you feel that weight, set the hook, start cranking. And make sure you reel. If you think it's the bottom, it probably is, but there is a chance that it's a very large fluke, so you want to make sure that you're in the bottom before you give up on that fish. So again, just to encapsulate the mid-season, we're fishing wrecks, we're making sure our bait's in the zone, we're moving our bait, same as in the bay. In the end of the season, so this is August, September, this goes into October. Unfortunately, our season doesn't, but the fish are still there. A lot of the fish that are in the wrecks in July and August are moving to deep water. So those fish that are at Barnegat Reef, those fish that are at Seagirt Reef, they're pushing into deeper reefs. They're fishing into 90, 100 feet of water. And you can go out there and you can target them the same way in deep water. You can still use the 4-ounce jigs just fine. So if you got a boat, as you get to the end of the season, you should be pushing deeper to look for those big fish. You also get a great opportunity at the end of the season to catch fish from land, because those final fish that are still staging in the bay, and this is more true down south, but it's true to Raritan Bay, Barnegat Bay, Great Bay, the bays that have deeper water, these fish are still in there in August, September, and even into October sometimes. And they're going to start pushing out of the bay, and it coincides with our fall run of bait fish. So we have a nice mullet run in the fall, we get a good sandio run in the fall, and those fish kind of hang tight to the beach. So these fish that are coming out of the bay at the end of the season are going to cut along the beach following the bait, and it becomes more of like a hunting than they are for the rest of the season. So you'll find them at jetties, you'll find them in cuts, like areas you would look for striped bass are going to hold fluke at the end of the season. I catch a lot of fluke in October and November when I'm plugging for striped bass on the beach, because the fluke are in there with the mullet, they're in there with the sandias doing the same thing the bass are. So that's a great time to, I don't fish the beach very often. I live a block away from it. I don't fish it all summer, but August, September, if it's a nice day, we have a west wind, I'll take my rod and I'll go fish the beach for fluke. So you got a good shot at big fish on the beach. Same thing, taking a light jig, as light as I can get away with depending on the size of surf. I want a big bait, typically 5 to 6 inch Gulp Grub, and I'm casting in the eddies and the areas of the surf that kind of hold that still water. That's where the fish are going to be staged up. Equipment wise, I'm using the same surf rods, the same rods that I fish in the ocean, the Shogun. I'm fishing my 7.6 Daiwa back bay. Simple stuff. It's all basically the same. The end of the season is the only time where I'll consider using a bait that is not an artificial gulp bait. So you'll see here I got a bluefish rigged up. I do enjoy fishing live baits at the end of the season. You have a really good shot late season in New Jersey for big fish, and big fish eat big baits. So this is probably a 6-inch, 7-inch, maybe even an 8-inch bluefish. I have a sliding rig that I use, so I put a hook in the head and I slide that tight, and I have a hook back here in the tail. This is just kind of in the skin, and I'll attach that to a 3-way rig, and that's, you can get away with kind of your drifting and dreaming. So I put a 3-way rig on, I focus less on the motor, and I kind of just drag that bait through the wrecks and through the areas that fish are gonna hunt. And if we're fishing a tournament and it's like a big fish tournament where you just need one jumbo fish to win, we're gonna take some time and we're gonna fish live baits. And it's the same situation. I mean, the fish just inhale these things. I got 2 hooks on there. Oftentimes both hooks are in the mouth when we set the hook and get the fish to the surface. So that is the only time of the year that I use live baits. If you don't have a boat, you don't know somebody with a boat, party boats are a great way to fish for fluke. We got a million of them in Jersey, especially in the summertime. I still will go out on a party boat. I can have my own boat. I go out with buddies all the time. I guess I'm just a degenerate gambler. I like the chance to win some money. You go out to Belmar on a Saturday. It's going to be a busy boat, but the pools on the boat are going to be upwards of $1,000. It's nice to go out and try to win that money. So basically, to be successful, we talked about on private boats, we're controlling the drift, we're controlling our speed. You obviously cannot do that on a party boat because you're not running the boat. So the party boat's going to drift however fast the party boat drifts. And every captain is going to drift the same way. They're going to go out to their spot, they're going to drift, they're going to set their drift up sideways, so one side of the boat has their lines going out, and the other side of the boat has their lines going under the boat. And then on the next drift, they're going to turn it around, and they're going to just go back and forth. They're going to do that all day long. So when your line's going out, you're good jigging the same way. Put that 4-ounce jig on, bump the bottom. If things get like really fast and you have to go heavier than 4 ounces to hold bottom, I'm going to switch to a chicken rig, which is just a big sinker at the bottom with 2 hooks coming out, and I'm going to fish 2 baits, and I'm just going to kind of slowly lift it, and you're basically drifting and dreaming at that point, but there's not much you can do because you can't control the speed of the boat. What I like to do on party boats, especially in those conditions, is I like to fish the back side of the drift. So I want to fish the side where the lines are going under the boat. I don't want my line to go under the boat, but that's the side of the boat I want to fish. And I want to take my spinning rod, and I want to take a 1 ounce or a 1.5 ounce jig head, and I'm going to cast it away from the boat as far as I can. And the boat's going to be drifting towards my jig, and I'm going to be bouncing my jig back to the boat. And that way I can control the speed of the presentation. So I can slow my jig down to stay in the strike zone while everybody else is worried about, you know, scoping out, their lines are going away. I'm getting my bait in prime presentation, and when it's straight up and down, ideally there's a fish that's been following it, and I can set the hook straight up and down. It's way easier to catch these fish. It's called vertical jigging for a reason when it's straight up and down. So that would be my #1 tip. If you're on a party boat, bring a spinning rod, bring something you can cast underhand. It's unsafe to do it overhand, and just flip it away from the boat as far as you can, jig it back. All right, so tournament fishing, that's what I'm all about. That's why some of you guys are here. Like I said, we won a boatload of money the last few years fishing for fluke. A lot of guys, you know, go out and they do these big money tuna tournaments. Well, I like to win some big money fluke fishing. And we got a couple tips for that. So, #1 thing, do your homework. So if you're fishing a tournament and it's, you know, most of them are on Saturdays, you're fishing a tournament Saturday. If you're a weekend fisherman, you can only get out on the weekends. Make sure you're out the week before that and you're kind of like scoping out areas. If you find an area that's holding fish, chances are it's still going to be holding those fish the following week. So you want to go out, you want to do your homework, you want to network with guys that are fishing, guys and girls that are fishing, and you want to kind of find areas that are hot. You want to know, know the fish were in 60 feet of water this week, or the fish were in 70 feet of water, they were biting good. So that's where we're gonna start. And develop a plan for your tournament and stick to that plan. If you say we're gonna hit this reef, and you go there and the fish aren't biting, don't abandon your plan. If you did your homework, you know there's fish there, grind it out, okay? Because you're gonna waste a lot of time moving around, and the fish are there, so they're gonna bite at some point during the day. I can tell you from experience, we've blown tournaments by abandoning our plan. So a couple years ago, we were fishing Secret Reef out of Belmar. We were doing very good on Secret Reef the entire week leading up to the tournament. Saturday came, it was a beautiful, gorgeous day. Everybody and their brother was out on Secret Reef. It was a parking lot. There was so many boats. The traffic was nuts. The fish were not biting at all. We were out there the day before. We had a bunch of fish. So we knew the fish were there. They're not just going to leave overnight, but they weren't biting. We thought the boat traffic had them shut off. So we decided to leave, and we went north. We hit the Shrewsbury Rocks. We went all the way up. We ended up right out of Raritan Bay. Fishing, just catching a couple fish here or there, picking a nice like 4-pound fish, a 5-pound fish. Good fish, but nothing good enough to win this tournament. And we end up working our way back south. And then at the end of the day, we go to the weigh-ins. We find out that the winning fish was caught on Secret Reef. The fish started biting there right shortly after noon. And that was it. And we had left, we abandoned our plan, and if we stuck it out, we would have had a better shot to win. So come up with a plan, stick to your plan, and just grind it out. You know, for better, for worse, some days you'll lose, some days you'll win, but stick to your plan. Also, don't be afraid to weigh in a fish that you think is not good enough to win the tournament. It might not be good enough to win the tournament, but it might cash. I put this picture up here on purpose. This is a just under 5-pound fish. This is not a big fish, right? It's a good fish, but it's not a big fish. 4.96 pounds. Tournament winner. We weren't even going to weigh in. I run the New Jersey Fishing Club. We ran a statewide tournament called Beat the Fleet, so from Cape May to Raritan Bay. Last year, we had a group of anglers. Some of you guys might know them, El Nino fishing team. They fished our tournament. They didn't show up to weigh-ins because they didn't think they had anything big enough to win. Well, they had something big enough for second place, and they lost out on like $6 grand because they just didn't show up. So set your plan, set a time to leave, make sure you can get to weigh-ins, weigh in what you catch. You never know. If it's a bad day fishing for you, chances are it's a bad day fishing for everybody if you're doing the right stuff. So those are my tips. That's what I got. If you have any questions, I'll take those now. Just right here.
Why is the wind effect of fluke fishing? Everyone has questions there. Why
So I'm not 100% sure that I would agree with the wind affects the fluke fishing. I think the wind affects the anglers. So if you have a stiff wind or you have a rough wind, a lot of guys are drifting too fast. They're drifting over the fish, and they're not able to slow their drift down and catch those fish. I never use, I'd use the motor. You can use a drift sock, it'll slow you down, but you have the same situation that you're drifting the wrong direction. I'd rather see you use a drift sock in the ocean than in the bay, but at the end of the day, you should just learn how, I mean, the boat's designed to slow itself down. So just keep the boat in gear, just drop it in reverse, and you'll slow yourself down enough. It just takes a second to slow yourself down, and then you can be right back to fishing. So. What else? I saw a couple hands, so that was it. Yep. So I use 30 to 40 pound typically, depending on the structure that I'm fishing. So some of the structure is more low lying. I can get away with something lighter because I'm not as nervous I'm going to break. But 40 pound is typically a good place to start. You don't want to go super long. I would say anywhere from like 2 feet to 5 feet of like a nice top shot. It's just going to give you enough abrasion resistance so your braid doesn't nick on something and you lose the fish. Yeah, I'm typically using fluoro, yeah. You can find with mono, it's, yeah. Well, 10's a little long. I usually won't go longer than like a rod length. So like 7 foot is probably the longest I'll go. And then I'm just using a single jig. So then if that breaks off, I'll just tie another one on until my leader gets too short and I'm not comfortable with it anymore. never use a swivel. So I tie direct every time. Yeah. So I learned an FG knot. You can get away with a uni to uni knot. There's a million knots you can tie. The FG knot is the strongest and most narrowest. A lot of the times these newer rods have very small guides, so the FG just kind of slides through nice and easy. It's a difficult knot to learn, but once you get it down, it's very easy to tie. I can tie in 45 seconds and be fishing again. So. Just because it's something else that can fail. So a swivel, you're tying 2 knots. You can tie 2. If it's dragging, it's something that could get caught up on. It's going to slow your drag down in the water because it's thicker than your line. I mean, the idea for me is I want to fish as light as line as possible so I can get a lighter jig down. If you have a bunch of hardware on there, and you have a heavier, you have a heavier leader, you have heavier line, you got big hardware. It's just more drag in the water. You put a teaser on there, that's even more drag on the water, and then that's when you're getting to like, I can't hold bottom with 4 ounces, I gotta have 8 ounces on, and you're just not getting the right movement on your jig. So. Back there. So I like the bow. It's not, for fluke fishing, it's not typically an area on the boat. So a lot of old timers like to fish the stern of the boat because way back when we had party boat blue fishing, and they would anchor up and they would chum. All the chum slick would go to the back of the boat, so that was the place to be because you were in the chum slick. Fluke, it doesn't matter. You can catch them in the bow, you can catch them in the stern, you can catch them midship. I like the bow because that's where the curve starts, and I can get my rod down. I got nice long arms, and I can fling my jig away farther. So it's just, for me, it's for casting. So bow's the best. If you can't get the bow, I go to the stern corners because you got a little bit more room, a little bit wider of a area to fish. But it does it. You can fish. You'll catch them anywhere. Yes. You gotta be a little louder. Sorry. What's the weight? So I'm using a 4-ounce jig. I'm sorry if I can't hear you right, but a 4-ounce jig. So it's typically, I think, like a 7/0 hook in there. I'm not using like a weight and an actual hook. I'm just using a jig with gulp. So if it's a 4-ounce, it's typically a 7/0 jig. Don't be afraid that your hook's too big. I mean, I'll use a 10/0 for fluke. The big fluke, I mean, even 5 pounds and bigger, their mouths are. They can fit the hook in there. Don't be afraid to go too small. The weight, the weight's on the jig. So it's just a jig, it just got a ball of weight and the hook comes right out of the circle. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about the mechanics of jigging? You said is that actually bouncing on the bottom, or is that lifting up and then jigging?
So you want to maintain contact with the bottom. So on the drop of so his question was, the mechanics of jigging. Should you be jigging on the bottom or should you lift the jig off the bottom and jig? So you want to maintain contact. So on my down jig, I should be coming into contact with the bottom. If I get to the point where I'm scoping out, then I'm slowing the boat down. Ideally, obviously you're not fishing a flat bottom, so the bottom might move a little bit. So you might miss the bottom a couple times. But if you feel like you're not, sometimes I'll check. I'll just drop my rod tip, and if my line goes slack, I know, if I'm not feeling it good, I know that my line's slack, that I'm on the bottom, and that's where I want to be. There's a little bit of a zone that you can be up off the bottom a little bit, but you don't want to get too far away. I mean, they're laying on the bottom, they're buried. Their vision, it depends on the clarity of the water, but their vision isn't going to be super excellent. So if you're 3 feet off the bottom, you might be going right over top the fish. You'll never know, and they'll never see your bait. So, yep. Diamond jigs will work for fluke, especially in the fall when there's a sand eel run. So some of the biggest fluke I ever caught, this is a long time ago now, but I was actually out on a party boat striper fishing with diamond jigs. This has got to be 15 years ago or more. And if your diamond jig hit the bottom, you caught a 7-pound fluke or bigger. It was a nuts day, but they were keyed in on the sand eel, so the diamond jig looks like a sand eel, but it'll work. Yeah. I mean, they're not very picky on what they're eating. They're pretty voracious predators. Anything that can fit in their mouth, they're going to try to swallow. But for whatever reason, the scent and the gulp definitely adds a level to what they go crazy for it. So. that's, I mean, you could try a diamond jig. I would just throw a gulp on there if I were you, but yeah, that'll work. The shape of the jig isn't super important. I like the round ball because it hits the bottom the fastest. Yes? So it's just I just use a plain ball jig. So it's just a round ball jig with a hook, and that is it. My goal is to eliminate the drag. So the bucktail hair just kind of adds drag, and it's just going to be something that slows your presentation down. Occasionally I'll put a bucktail on, like if I'm fishing the surf, something where the drag might not matter. I kind of want the bait to suspend in the water a little longer. But yeah, for the ocean, just a bare jig, bare hook. Color doesn't matter. A lot of times I'm fishing just an unpainted silver jig. I mean, they're going to sell them to you in a million colors. That's for you guys. That's not, the fish don't care, right? They want to sell to the customer. That's it. Yeah. Yep. So in the ocean, I use a 6-inch Gulp Grub. So I typically just buy that in a couple colors. I like white. I'll buy the white glow, because if the water's dirty, maybe that'll add an effect. But typically just white is my go-to. I mean, it's going to look like a fish all the time. I think more with the Gulp, it's about the shade than it is the actual color. So I'll have white, and then I like to buy like a couple of the natural shades, like the mackerel, like the darker greens. They're just kind of more of a natural presentation, and I think the fish kind of key into a shade more than they do a color. Like I don't think you need, you don't need Fire Tiger because your buddy caught it on fire. You know, if you're switching Gulps because he caught it on Fire Tiger and then you put it on Fire Tiger, of course Fire Tiger is going to be hot because everybody's using it. If you just fish the same color all day, you're going to catch them, you know, so don't go crazy. Yeah, so good question. So if there's no drift, days, wind against tide, or just no wind, no tide, absolutely. So I'll get on my mark, sometimes I'll just, if there's absolutely no drift, I'll just put the boat on top of the wreck and I'll cast around. But yeah, we'll definitely power drift, put the boat in gear, kind of move yourself around. I mean, ideally you want to cover some ground and find out where those fish are. Definitely, good question. Anybody else? So just want to say thank you guys for your time. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming out. And I'll hang around for a little bit. If you guys have any other questions, come on up. But thanks again, and have a good day. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Have you ever heard of a blackfish?
Yeah, Frank told me about those.